Her name was Sister Clara, a young novice who had only recently taken her vows. She was eager to prove her faith and dedication, but her heart carried shadows from a past she barely remembered, whispers of abandonment and a childhood plagued by inexplicable nightmares. When the Mother Superior of her convent asked for volunteers to visit the derelict convent of St. Bartholomew for a spiritual retreat, Clara didn't hesitate. The place was infamous among the nuns for its grim history, stories of mysterious disappearances and whispered hauntings that had turned it into a forgotten relic atop a lonely hill. The convent loomed like a corpse against the overcast sky, its stone walls cracked and veined with creeping ivy. The air smelled of decay and dampness, and the wind howled through broken windows, carrying faint echoes of something that sounded disturbingly like weeping. Clara's arrival was met with an oppressive silence, as though the very ground beneath her feet was holding its breath. She couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching her from the shadows. Inside, the walls were adorned with faded frescoes of saints, their once kind faces now warped by time into grotesque visages that seemed to sneer at her. The air grew heavier with each step, filled with the scent of burning wax and an undertone of something metallic, iron, or perhaps blood. In one corner of the main hall, Clara noticed a large object draped with a tattered cloth. It stood apart from the other relics, as if purposefully hidden. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and unease, she approached it, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the vast, empty space. When Clara pulled back the cloth, she revealed a tall, ornate mirror, its gilded frame tarnished and covered in strange, intricate symbols. The glass was murky, and for a moment, Clara thought it wasn't reflecting her at all. She leaned closer, and that's when she noticed it, movement. Not hers, but something deeper, almost imperceptible, like shadows shifting just beyond the veil. She stumbled back, her pulse quickening as a chill spread down her spine. The mirror seemed to breathe, the tarnish on its surface slowly receding as though revealing a hidden truth. And then it happened, a faint whisper, so soft she might have imagined it. "Help us," it said, in a voice that didn't belong to this world. From that moment, Clara knew she had uncovered something far beyond her understanding. She was no longer just a novice in search of spiritual growth. She was a witness to a secret that the convent of St. Bartholomew had buried for centuries. The first night at the convent of St. Bartholomew was cold and suffocating, as if the very air was pressing against Clara's chest. Her room, modest and dimly lit by a single candle, carried an inexplicable chill. She had carefully avoided looking at the mirror again after covering it with the cloth, but even in its concealed state, it felt as though the mirror's presence was alive, lurking in the edges of her mind. As Clara lay in bed, the shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, creeping up the walls like dark fingers. Her candle flickered violently, casting strange shapes that danced and twisted, forming fleeting images of anguished faces. She closed her eyes tightly, clutching the rosary around her neck, and began to pray. But the prayers felt hollow, each word echoing back to her as if the walls themselves were mocking her faith. That night, Clara dreamed. At least, she told herself it was a dream. She found herself standing in the convent's main hall, though it was different, decayed beyond recognition. The frescoes were blackened and peeling, and the air was thick with a foul, sulfuric stench. The mirror stood uncovered, its glass glowing faintly in the darkness. Clara's feet moved on their own, dragging her closer to the cursed object. The glass was no longer murky but clear, almost too clear, as if it were a window rather than a mirror. Beyond its surface was a desolate landscape shrouded in mist, where twisted, skeletal trees clawed at a blood-red sky. Figures moved in the fog, human shapes, gaunt and hollow-eyed, their mouths open in silent screams. One of them turned its head sharply toward Clara, its eyes locking with hers through the glass. She couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure pressed its hands against the other side of the mirror, and Clara felt a cold, unholy energy radiating from it. Its lips moved, but the words were incomprehensible, a guttural, otherworldly language that felt like nails scraping inside her skull. Suddenly, its voice became clear, cutting through the oppressive silence. "Release us." Clara awoke with a start, her body drenched in sweat despite the freezing air. The room was pitch black, her candle extinguished, though she had lit it before falling asleep. Her heart raced as she fumbled for the matches, but before she could relight the flame, she heard it, the faint sound of scratching coming from the direction of the mirror. Frozen with fear, Clara forced herself to look. The cloth covering the mirror had slipped, exposing the top corner of the glass. In that small patch, she saw movement. Not her reflection, but something darker, writhing just beneath the surface. The scratching grew louder, almost frantic, as if whatever was trapped inside was desperately trying to escape. Clara scrambled to cover the mirror fully, her trembling hands struggling to pull the cloth into place. When she finally succeeded, the scratching stopped abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. She fell to her knees, her breath shallow and erratic, as a single thought echoed in her mind. The mirror is awake. Morning came, but it brought no comfort. Clara avoided the mirror at all costs, yet its presence felt stronger, as though it was calling to her, whispering in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that her dream wasn't a dream at all, that she had truly glimpsed something forbidden, something that should have remained hidden. And deep inside, she knew the mirror wasn't finished with her. It had only just begun. The days in the convent of St. Bartholomew stretched endlessly, each moment steeped in a heavy, unshakable dread. Sister Clara tried to distract herself with prayers, chores, and scripture readings, but her thoughts always drifted back to the mirror. It was as though it had latched onto her soul, pulling her closer to its dark secrets. The whispers in her dreams grew louder each night, and the faces in the fog became clearer, their expressions etched with unbearable agony. By the third day, Clara began to notice peculiarities in the convent itself. Hallways she had walked through countless times seemed to shift, elongating or leading her to unfamiliar rooms. Doors creaked open on their own, revealing darkened spaces that seemed to breathe with unseen life. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, though no one had lit any. Shadows flickered on walls where no light should have cast them, their movements unnatural and deliberate, as if watching her every step. That evening, she heard it again, the faint scratching. It wasn't coming from the mirror this time, but from the walls surrounding her room. At first, it was soft, almost like the sound of rats scurrying through the old stone. But it grew louder, more deliberate, until it became clear. This was no animal. The scratches formed patterns, almost rhythmic, like a desperate code being etched into the stone. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, Clara pressed her ear to the wall. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint whisper. It wasn't in a language she recognized, yet the meaning was unmistakable. "Look at us." She staggered back, clutching her rosary tightly, but the voice persisted, now louder, echoing in her mind. "Look at us, Clara." Terrified yet compelled, she found herself returning to the main hall where the mirror stood. The cloth covering it was pristine when she had left it earlier, but now it lay crumpled on the floor, as if deliberately removed. The mirror gleamed faintly in the dim light, its surface unnaturally smooth and inviting. Clara's reflection stared back at her, but there was something wrong. Her reflection wasn't mimicking her movements. She raised a trembling hand to touch her face, but her mirrored self stood motionless, its eyes fixed on hers with an unnatural intensity. Then it smiled, a slow, chilling smile that spread across its face like a crack splitting open. Behind her reflection, shadows began to gather in the glass, taking shape into the gaunt figures from her dreams. Their hands pressed against the inside of the mirror, leaving smudges of darkness that pulsed like veins. One of the figures leaned close, its hollow eyes boring into Clara's. "You cannot leave us here," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. The reflection of Clara reached out toward the glass, its fingers curling as if to beckon her closer. Before she could react, the room erupted with a deafening noise, a low, guttural roar that seemed to come from within the mirror itself. The glass rippled like water, and the shadows inside surged forward, their faces twisted into masks of despair and rage. Clara stumbled back, tripping over the cloth that had once concealed the cursed object. The air grew colder, each breath escaping her lips as a visible cloud. The figures in the mirror began to chant, their voices rising in a haunting, discordant harmony. Though Clara couldn't understand the words, she felt their meaning. "You are the key. Set us free." Overwhelmed by fear, Clara scrambled to her feet and fled the hall, her heartbeat pounding like a drum in her ears. But even as she locked the door behind her, she could still hear the voices, whispering, pleading, growing louder with every second. The mirror had awakened fully now, and Clara knew there was no escape from its grasp. It was not just a reflection, it was a gateway, and it wanted her to open it. Each shadow in the convent seemed darker now, every creak and groan of the old building more menacing. Clara could feel it. The mirror was no longer confined to the hall. Its presence was everywhere, spreading like a contagion, pulling her deeper into its nightmarish world. And as she clutched her rosary and prayed for strength, the whispers echoed in her mind, relentless and unyielding. "Look at us, Clara. Look at us." That night, Clara's resolve broke. Her prayers felt hollow, and the whispers refused to be silenced. She barricaded herself in her room, lighting every candle she could find, but the oppressive darkness seemed to creep in regardless, snuffing out the light with an unnatural force. The mirror's presence was no longer confined to the hall. It had taken root in her mind, an invasive presence she couldn't escape. Sleep came reluctantly, dragging her into a world she feared more than the waking one. This time, the dream wasn't fragmented or fleeting. It was vivid, immersive, and terrifyingly real. Clara found herself in the same desolate landscape she had glimpsed before through the mirror, a barren wasteland shrouded in ash and mist. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and lifeless, emitting a faint, eerie glow. The sky was blood-red, devoid of stars, and the air carried the acrid stench of decay. From the fog emerged the figures she had seen before, their forms clearer now. They were twisted, emaciated, their faces grotesque masks of suffering. Their eyes burned with a pale, unholy light, and their mouths gaped open as if screaming, though no sound escaped. They moved toward her with agonizing slowness, their bony hands outstretched, pleading. "Free us, Clara," they whispered in unison, their voices a dreadful harmony that reverberated in the air. One of the figures stepped closer, its skeletal hand brushing against her arm. The touch was freezing, like ice piercing her skin. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Then the landscape began to shift. The ground beneath her feet trembled, splitting open to reveal jagged chasms that glowed with an infernal light. From these cracks emerged a cacophony of screams, dissonant and horrifying, as if the earth itself was wailing in torment. The figures around her sank to their knees, their faces contorted in despair, and Clara realized they weren't just trapped, they were being punished. Suddenly, Clara's attention was drawn to the distance, where the mirror stood like a monolith, towering over the barren plain. Its surface pulsed with a sickly light, the same symbols etched into its frame now glowing and shifting as though alive. The figures turned their hollow eyes toward it, their voices rising in desperation. "You must end it. You must break the seal." Clara took a step toward the mirror, drawn by a force she couldn't resist. With each step, the air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest until it felt like she was drowning. The chanting of the figures became deafening, their words overlapping in a maddening chorus. As she reached the mirror, her reflection stared back at her, but it was no longer her own. The Clara in the mirror was pale, her eyes sunken and glowing with the same unnatural light as the figures. Her lips twisted into a mocking smile, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. "You've already opened the door. There's no turning back now." Suddenly, the reflection reached through the glass, its hand breaching the surface like water. Clara tried to pull away, but it was too late. The hand gripped her wrist, ice-cold and unyielding, and began to pull her toward the mirror. The world around her dissolved into chaos, the ground cracking open beneath her, the figures writhing and screaming, and the sky splitting apart as if reality itself were unraveling. Just as she was about to be dragged fully into the mirror, Clara awoke with a violent jolt. She was back in her room, her body drenched in sweat, her rosary lying broken on the floor. The candles she had lit were extinguished, and the room was filled with an eerie, pulsating glow coming from under the door. Terrified, she forced herself to her feet and opened the door to find the light spilling from the main hall. She knew what awaited her, but there was no choice now. The mirror had called her, and she was powerless to resist. As she stepped into the hall, she found the mirror uncovered, its surface alive with writhing shadows and ghostly faces. The whispers from her dreams now filled the room, louder and more insistent. "End it, Clara. End it now." The final choice loomed before her: face the mirror and the horror it contained, or flee and live with the knowledge that she had left those souls to their eternal torment. But Clara knew deep down that there was no escape. The mirror was a gateway, and it had chosen her. With trembling hands, she stepped closer to the mirror, its surface rippling like liquid. The shadows within seemed to surge toward her, and her own reflection reached out once more. This time, Clara didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, whispered a desperate prayer, and touched the glass. The room erupted into chaos, the mirror's light engulfing her as the whispers turned into a deafening roar. Then silence. Clara was gone, and the mirror stood dormant once more, its surface dark and lifeless. But if one looked closely enough, they might see a faint, ghostly figure trapped within the glass, a shadow of a young nun, her hands pressed against the surface, her lips forming silent pleas for freedom. The morning after the nightmare felt like stepping into a world that was no longer her own. The convent of St. Bartholomew seemed unchanged to the untrained eye, but Clara felt it. The oppressive air, the unnatural silence, the sense that she was being watched by unseen forces. The mirror was silent now, its surface dull and lifeless, as if waiting for her next move. But Clara knew that what she had experienced was no dream. The sensation of the figure's cold hand still lingered on her wrist, a phantom touch that refused to fade. Determined to understand the truth, Clara began searching through the convent's archives. In a forgotten corner of the library, buried beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, she found a collection of leather-bound journals. They belonged to Father Gregor, the last priest to reside at the convent before its closure decades ago. The entries were erratic, descending into madness as they progressed. The early pages described a mysterious artifact delivered to the convent, a mirror rumored to be centuries old, retrieved from a desecrated chapel in a distant land. The priest detailed the mirror's arrival with unease, describing how its ornate frame was etched with symbols he couldn't decipher. It is said to be a relic of the purgatorial realm, one entry read, "A window between our world and the damned." As Clara flipped through the journal, the entries became more disturbing. Father Gregor wrote of strange occurrences, shadows moving independently of light, voices whispering in the night, and the mirror's surface rippling as though alive. The priest confessed his growing fear, claiming that the mirror had begun to haunt his dreams. One entry, scrawled with trembling handwriting, stood out, "The souls trapped within call to me. They beg for release, but I fear their freedom may come at too great a cost." Clara's blood ran cold. She realized that the faces she had seen in her dreams were the same souls Father Gregor had written about. The connection between the mirror and the purgatorial realm was undeniable, but what shocked her most was the final entry in the journal. The mirror chooses its keeper. It binds itself to those it deems worthy, or perhaps vulnerable. "It has chosen me, but I cannot bear this burden. I must end it before it consumes my soul." The entry ended abruptly, the last words smudged as though written in a panic. Clara searched for any record of what had happened to Father Gregor, but found nothing. It was as if he had vanished, his existence erased from the convent's history. With this new knowledge, Clara couldn't ignore the growing realization that the mirror had now chosen her. The dreams, the whispers, the figures, they were all connected. But why her? Was it because of her faith? Her vulnerability? Or something buried deep in her past that even she didn't understand? That night, Clara returned to the main hall, unable to resist the pull of the mirror. It stood as it always had, silent and foreboding, but she could feel its presence like a weight pressing on her chest. She hesitated before stepping closer, her heart pounding in her ears. Her reflection stared back, but this time it wasn't alone. The shadowy figures were there again, their faces pressed against the glass. One of them mouthed a word, "Help." Clara felt a rush of cold air, as though the room itself had exhaled. Then something new caught her eye, a detail she hadn't noticed before. Etched into the bottom corner of the mirror's frame was a name, Clara. Her knees buckled, and she stumbled backward, her mind racing. How could this be? The mirror had been in the convent long before her time. Yet there it was, her name engraved in the tarnished gold, as though it had been waiting for her all along. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. She wasn't just a victim of the mirror's curse, she was part of its history. But what connection did she have to this object of torment? And what would happen if she failed to uncover the truth? The room grew colder, and the mirror's surface began to ripple once more. The figures inside moved closer, their whispers growing louder, forming a single, haunting command: find the truth. Or be consumed. The discovery left Clara shaken, but it also steeled her resolve. She would uncover the secrets of the mirror, no matter the cost. For she now understood one terrible truth. Her soul was already bound to it, and the only way to break the curse was to confront the darkness head-on. The days blurred into nights, and Clara's reality became an unrelenting nightmare. The mirror's influence seeped into every corner of the convent, warping her perception of time and space. Hallways grew longer, shadows writhed like living entities, and whispers seemed to follow her wherever she went. Sleep became an impossibility. Every time her eyes closed, she was dragged into a purgatorial landscape more vivid and terrifying than before. Clara's resolve to uncover the truth consumed her, and with each passing hour, the weight of the mirror's curse grew heavier. She returned to the library, combing through every book, journal, and scrap of parchment she could find. Her fingers trembled as she pieced together fragmented accounts of the mirror's past. Stories of entire families destroyed by madness, priests driven to self-destruction, and souls bound to eternal suffering. One evening, Clara stumbled upon an old, brittle map hidden inside a locked drawer. It depicted the convent and a series of underground chambers beneath it. The map was annotated with cryptic notes, referencing a ritual site and a forgotten chamber referred to as the Sanctum of Reflection. The markings suggested this was where the mirror had been placed during its arrival centuries ago, a place where it had been sealed. But sealed from what? Compelled by a growing sense of urgency, Clara descended into the depths of the convent that night, armed only with a flickering lantern and her rosary. The staircase leading to the underground chambers was narrow and suffocating, each step echoing like a death knell. The air grew colder as she descended, carrying the scent of damp stone and something faintly metallic. At the bottom, she found herself in a vast, circular chamber. The walls were lined with strange carvings, symbols identical to those etched into the mirror's frame. They seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as though alive. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, empty but unmistakably designed to hold the mirror. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, making it difficult to breathe. Clara's lantern flickered violently, and she felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The oppressive silence was broken by a low, guttural sound, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the very walls. She froze as the shadows around her began to move, coalescing into shapes that resembled the figures she had seen in the mirror. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths opened in unison, emitting a soundless scream. A voice echoed through the chamber, low and raspy, as if spoken by many tongues at once. "You should not be here." Clara gripped her rosary tightly, her knuckles white with fear, but she forced herself to speak. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figures did not move closer, but their presence felt suffocating. The voice returned, more forceful this time. "You are the key. You have always been the key." Before Clara could respond, one of the shadows broke away from the group and lunged toward her. She stumbled backward, falling to the cold, damp floor as the shadow loomed over her. It didn't attack, but instead whispered directly into her ear, "The truth lies within. But to find it, you must lose yourself." In an instant, the shadow was gone, and the chamber fell silent once more. Clara's breathing was ragged as she scrambled to her feet, her mind racing with questions. She knew the answer lay with the mirror, but the thought of confronting it again filled her with dread. As she ascended the stairs back to the main hall, the whispers began anew, following her like a ghostly choir. The figures in the mirror were growing restless, their faces appearing in every reflective surface she passed. Windows, puddles, even the polished wood of the pews. They were waiting, and Clara knew she was running out of time. The following night, Clara encountered a visitor she hadn't expected. An elderly woman appeared at the convent's gate, claiming to have lived there decades ago. Her face was weathered, her eyes filled with a sorrow that Clara recognized immediately. The woman introduced herself as Sister Magdalene and said she had returned because she felt the mirror's call. Sister Magdalene revealed that she had been a young novice when the mirror first arrived at the convent. She spoke of the same dreams, the same whispers, and the same unbearable weight that Clara now carried. But Magdalene had fled, abandoning her vows and the others to their fate. "I thought I could escape," she said, her voice breaking. "But the mirror never lets go. It finds you no matter where you hide." Clara begged Magdalene for guidance, but the old woman shook her head. "I can only tell you this," she said. "To end the curse, you must face what lies within. But beware, the mirror does not reveal truths lightly. It will take from you everything you hold dear." That night, Clara sat before the mirror once more, her reflection flickering like a ghost. The air around her was electric, vibrating with a dark energy that made her skin crawl. As she reached out to touch the glass, she whispered a prayer, not for salvation, but for the strength to confront the horror waiting on the other side. The mirror pulsed beneath her fingertips, its surface rippling like water. The shadows within surged forward, their faces pressing against the glass, and Clara felt the world around her begin to dissolve. The descent into darkness was complete, and the mirror's truth was ready to consume her. The air around the mirror was suffocating, as if the room itself was closing in on Clara. Shadows pooled at the edges of the walls, writhing and pulsating like living entities, watching her every move. The mirror's surface rippled unnaturally, its reflective glass glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Clara stood motionless, the weight of her dread pressing her feet into the cold stone floor. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she knew there was no running from the mirror now. Clara reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the surface of the glass. It felt warm and alive, as though a pulse throbbed beneath her touch. The rippling intensified, and then, with a flash of light so blinding it forced her to shield her eyes, the mirror pulled her in. The sensation was like plunging into freezing water, icy tendrils wrapping around her body and dragging her into the abyss. When she opened her eyes, Clara was no longer in the convent. She stood in a desolate wasteland, the same barren purgatory she had seen in her dreams. The sky was an unnatural shade of crimson, fractured by jagged black streaks of lightning. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and lifeless, glowing faintly with a sickly green hue. The air was thick and oppressive, filled with the acrid stench of sulfur and decay. All around her, the damned souls she had glimpsed through the mirror emerged from the mist, their twisted forms illuminated by the unnatural light. Their eyes glowed like dying embers, and their mouths moved in unison, whispering a chorus of despair. "Why did you come here, Clara?" Their voices echoed, a haunting blend of sorrow and accusation. Clara clutched her rosary tightly, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I came to free you." One of the souls stepped forward, its face gaunt and hollow, its skeletal hands reaching out to her. "You cannot free us," it rasped. "You can only take our place." The weight of the words hit Clara like a blow, but before she could respond, the ground beneath her feet began to crack open. From the fissures emerged tendrils of black smoke, twisting and coiling like serpents. They surrounded her, cutting off her escape, their touch cold and searing all at once. Through the haze, a figure began to emerge, a towering shadow with piercing red eyes that glowed like twin infernos. Its form was indistinct, shifting and writhing like smoke, but its presence was overwhelming, radiating a power so dark and ancient it made Clara's knees buckle. The shadow's voice was a guttural growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through her very bones. "You seek the truth, child? Then behold it." In an instant, the shadow lunged forward, and Clara was engulfed in darkness. Visions flooded her mind, flashes of lives ruined by the mirror, of souls consumed and bound to its curse. She saw Father Gregor, his face twisted in terror as the mirror claimed him. She saw Sister Magdalene fleeing into the night, the mirror's reflection chasing her even in her dreams. And she saw herself, a child, standing before the mirror in a forgotten corner of her orphanage, its surface glowing faintly as it whispered her name. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. The mirror had been with her all along, weaving its curse into her life, guiding her to this moment. She was never meant to destroy it, she was meant to replace it. The shadow loomed over her, its voice a deafening roar. The cycle must continue. Will you embrace your fate? Clara's heart pounded as she looked into the mirror, now standing before her like a monolith. The faces of the damned stared back at her, their eyes filled with desperation and sorrow. He understood now that the mirror was a prison, a gateway to purgatory that demanded a keeper to maintain the balance. Tears streamed down her face as she realized what she had to do. Taking a deep breath, Clara stepped forward, her reflection mirroring her movements. With trembling hands, she touched the glass once more, and the shadow's voice echoed one final time. "Welcome home." The world dissolved into darkness, and when Clara opened her eyes again, she was back in the convent's main hall. The mirror stood before her, silent and still, its surface a perfect reflection. But as she stepped closer, she saw her own face within it. Not her current self, but a pale, hollow version of her, eyes glowing faintly with the same unholy light as the souls she had sought to free. Clara's voice echoed in the empty hall, soft and mournful. The truth lies within the reflection. But some truths are too heavy to bear. She was no longer just a victim of the mirror's curse, she was its keeper. And as the mirror's glow faded, the shadows in the hall seemed to retreat, leaving the convent silent once more. But if anyone dared to look into the mirror, they might see her there, trapped within the glass, watching and waiting for the next soul brave, or foolish, enough to confront it. The convent was eerily quiet, its vast, empty halls cloaked in shadow. The once suffocating presence of the mirror had lifted, but the air still felt heavy, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Sister Clara was gone, vanished without a trace. Yet her presence lingered, faint and spectral, like an echo of a prayer lost to time. The mirror now stood in the center of the main hall, its ornate frame restored to its original brilliance. It gleamed with an almost hypnotic allure, its surface perfectly polished and unnervingly still. The scratches and stains that had marred it before were gone, but something about its pristine appearance felt wrong, unnatural. No one dared approach it, yet its pull was undeniable. The whispers began almost immediately. The new novices assigned to clean the hall reported hearing faint voices, soft and pleading, emanating from the mirror. Some claimed to see fleeting images in its reflection, shadows moving where no one stood, faces that weren't their own. Rumors spread quickly among the sisters, tales of Clara's disappearance intertwined with older stories of the mirror's dark history. The whispers turned into nightmares. Those who slept too close to the hall where the mirror resided reported vivid, disturbing dreams, visions of a desolate wasteland shrouded in crimson light, filled with anguished figures and the unmistakable sound of Clara's voice. She was calling to them, warning them, but her words were drowned out by a chorus of other voices, screaming in despair. One night, a novice named Sister Maria couldn't resist the mirror's call. The whispers had grown louder, persistent, and impossible to ignore. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were thoughts, threading through her mind, beckoning her to come closer. Against her better judgment, Maria lit a candle and entered the hall. The mirror was silent, its surface serene and reflective. But as Maria approached, her reflection began to change. At first, it was subtle, a flicker, a slight delay in movement. Then her reflection froze entirely, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. The candle in her hand sputtered, and the room grew colder. "Clara," Maria whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection smiled, but it wasn't Maria's smile. It was Clara's, a sad, knowing expression that sent chills down Maria's spine. The surface of the mirror rippled, and for a fleeting moment, Maria saw the purgatorial realm Clara had described in her journals. The figures within turned their hollow eyes toward her, their mouths forming silent pleas. Maria stumbled back, her candle falling to the floor and extinguishing itself in the process. Darkness consumed the hall, but the glow from the mirror remained. It pulsed faintly like the beating of a heart, and Maria heard a single, unmistakable whisper, "You're next." By morning, Maria was gone. Her bed was untouched, her belongings left behind. The sisters searched the convent grounds but found no sign of her. The mirror, however, had changed. Its surface was no longer pristine. Faint handprints now marred the glass, as though someone had pressed against it from the inside, desperately trying to escape. The Mother Superior ordered the hall to be sealed, but the mirror's presence could not be contained. Strange occurrences began to plague the convent, candles extinguishing on their own, the sound of footsteps in empty corridors, and the faint echo of Clara's voice reciting prayers that no one could understand. The convent's reputation as a holy retreat was replaced with whispers of its cursed artifact. Pilgrims and the curious began to arrive, drawn by tales of the haunted mirror. Some claimed to see their own faces in its reflection, aged and twisted with fear. Others swore they heard their names called softly when they stood too close. And then one day the mirror vanished. It was as if it had never been there, leaving behind only an empty space in the hall. The handprints, the whispers, the nightmares, they all ceased. The sisters felt a collective relief, but the absence of the mirror brought its own unease. Where had it gone? Years later, stories began to surface in another part of the world. A merchant claimed to have found an antique mirror with a golden frame etched with strange symbols. He spoke of its mesmerizing beauty, its allure, and the whispers that seemed to emanate from its glass. He said it was unlike anything he had ever seen, and that its reflection felt alive. The mirror's curse had moved on, carrying Clara's soul and the souls of countless others trapped within its glass. Its story was far from over, its hunger far from sated. Somewhere it waits, biding its time, drawing in new victims who dare to look too deeply into their own reflection. And so the mirror remains, a mystery, a curse, and a warning. What would you do if you found yourself standing before it? Would you dare look into its depths? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most terrifying truths are the ones staring back at us from the other side of the glass.